Good evening, bonsoir. Welcome to the all-party town hall on the future of Canada's audio-video industry. My name is Warren Sonoda. I'm a Canadian filmmaker, and I'm speaking to you tonight as DGC National President from Toronto. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional Indigenous lands that we all live and gather on today. Although this meeting is online and our event takes place at many locations across Canada, we each enjoy the pleasure of living and working within an Indigenous territory. Now, as a gesture of appreciation for our use of their lands, I'd like to ask each of us to offer a positive thought for their local Indigenous people and a hope for their health and wellness during this time of uncertainty. Also, personally, I urge you to see DGC directors Dennis Goulet's Night Raiders, currently premiering at TIFF. On behalf of the Directors Guild of Canada, a national labor organization that represents more than 6,000 key creative and logistical personnel in the film, television, and digital media industries, and our partner organizations in Quebec's French Language Association of Filmmakers, ARRQ, and ACTRA, which represents over 27,000 professional performers working in English language recorded media in Canada. I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us this evening from coast to coast, especially our teammates at our fellow guilds, unions, and organizations, to learn more about the party's commitments towards our vibrant and vital film, television, and media sector. Our moderators will do their best to have your questions answered. I'm just going to remind our panelists right now, if you can mute your microphones until we introduce you, we might be hearing some feedback from your microphones. Thank you. I do have the pleasure to announce that all 5 parties represented in the House of Commons have accepted our invitation to participate. I'd like to give special thanks and introduce the candidates and representatives present with us tonight. Minister Stephen Guilbeault, candidate for Laurier-Sainte-Marie, Quebec, Liberal Party. Kevin Waugh, candidate for Saskatoon-Grasswood, Saskatchewan, Conservative Party. Martin Champeau, candidate for Drummond, Quebec, Bloc Québécois. Heather McPherson, candidate for Edmonton Strathcona, Alberta. And Sandy Crowley, Green Party's shadow cabinet critic for arts, culture, and heritage. Now, there's no doubt that our screen sector is undergoing a radical transformation. I'm personally coming off of 3 straight streamer shows myself. With the modernization of the Broadcasting Act pending, the review of the Copyright Act awaiting to be completed, the need to address sustainability and climate action within our industry practices, and the necessity to achieve greater inclusion and equity, there is a clear need for political action and no shortage of questions for our candidates tonight. Each candidate will have a maximum of 15 minutes to answer a set of questions from our co-moderators and can answer in the language of their choice. Tonight, we're happy to provide you simultaneous translation in English and French during this evening's Zoom webinar. So you can pick the language of your choice, just click the interpretation button on your Zoom window. We've received audience questions in advance from the registration form you filled out, and we've selected some of them that will be asked at the end of each candidate interview. Right now, I would like to invite Gabrielle Pelletier, President of ARRQ, to speak. Gabrielle.
Merci Warren. D'abord, je voudrais souhaiter la bienvenue à nos participants francophones à cette assemblée virtuelle.
So thank you, Warren. I'd like to welcome all Francophone attendants, and I would like to thank you for taking the initiative to create this meeting and give a chance to the different parties running at the election to talk about our audiovisual meeting and discussion. So thank you to the DGC, and thank you to the representatives of the different parties who accepted the invitation to talk to us. And I do represent directors from both sexes that work in French in Quebec. So of course there are very specific themes that have everything to do with our language on screens. So I can't wait for the parties to start the discussion. Without waiting any longer, I'll give the floor to Warren to give us a go.
And thank you, ARRQ. I will now invite our co-moderators, Trina McQueen and Patrick White, to join us. You have a great evening ahead of you. Trina is the co-director of the media program at the Schulich School of Business at York University in Toronto. Patrick White is the head of journalism of the journalism program at the Université du Québec et Montréal. Together, you share an extensive knowledge of the Canadian screen and media industry. We are so pleased to have you with us tonight. I will now give you the floor and let you introduce the themes that will be discussed.
Well, thank you very much. And we're both very impressed by the work that you've done and the attendance that you have in the audience, and also that the five party representatives are with us. 4 themes have been chosen by the sponsors to be examined with the 5 representatives. And I'm going to do the first 2, and Patrick will fill you in on the next 2. First of all, we'd like to know from the representatives how we can, the industry and you, can work together to take advantage of what is an enormously full of potential sector. We've seen very clearly over the last few years how the public's craving for content, good content in every audiovisual field has grown, and Canadians have the talent and the voices to really exploit this opportunity and make Canadian television absolutely as wonderful and as internationally famous as it should be. So there are now 244,000 people employed in this industry. My guess is that by the end of the year, when COVID's over, we will easily have 300,000 and more to come. The second theme, we'd like to know how we can collaborate to make sure that Canadian voices and Canadian talent can work in Canada without having to leave to exploit their talent in some other countries. So we're looking for ideas from you as to how we can work together to get that done. Patrick?
Oui, bien évidemment, on a 4 thèmes importants ce soir. Le sujet numéro 1, pour commencer, c'est
Yes, indeed, we have 4 important themes tonight. And the first theme is the growth of broadcasting system in Canada that was studied with the Act C10 that was adopted at the Parliament but never went beyond. So we want to modify the legislative framework and going against the reduction of productions in Canada. The second theme is how can we promote the sustainability and growth of the Canadian content, offering more opportunities for creative talent here in the country. And the third theme is a more diversified and equitable industry. How can we put forward all of the issues regarding diversity and also the addition of the LGBTQ2+, and how can we show them more on screens? And then the sustainable duration and incentives. Can we have tax credits to compensate sustainable productions or certifications in Canada? How can we encourage productions to reduce their carbon and the gas emissions? And we will be discussing this with the Minister Guilbeault from the candidate at the election, and all of the other parties, Martin Champoux, candidate later for the Bloc Québécois, and the representative of Strathcona and Edmonton, and also Sydney Crowley for arts, culture, and heritage for the shadow. So these are all the persons that will give us a presentation of the position of their party. So back to you.
Thank you. Well, actually, it's going to be back to you, Patrick, because you are up first with our Liberal representative, Minister Guilbeault.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Guilbeault. Merci d'avoir accepté notre invitation ce soir,
Well,
évidemment.
thank you, Mr. Guilbeault. Thank you for accepting our invite tonight. The fact that the Bill C-10 did not go before the Senate, and we went directly through the start of the election. So what is your program, your plan, if you're reelected next September 20th regarding broadcasting? So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to all of you. And I'd like to mention that I am on the Mohawk territory, the Anishinaabe territory in Montreal, and I'd like to recognize this. And three things regarding your questions. The ones that are with us tonight know very well that we are the government that has tried for 30 years to modify the laws, and we've worked for a full year to introduce the Bill C-10 according to the yield recommendations. So for the ones who went to our electoral platforms on the questions of arts and culture, we'll see that the yield report is found there. So we've filed the C-10 bill. It went up to the Senate. It was not adopted, but we engaged ourselves to file a new version of the C-10 bill during the 101st day of a new mandate. And we believe that we should also modernize, just as we have to modernize the law on broadcasting, and we have to go forth with modernizing, for example, the use of internet, also as we do today, and through telefilm, through the National Bureau of Films and the media funds. We need them to have the necessary tools in order to support our creators, males and females, our people that work in the audiovisual environment in a world that is amidst of the 21st century and has changed in the past 2-3 years. So we also want to increase the support from the government to this sector. So we engage ourselves to increase the funding to telefilm by 50 million over a 3-year period on our platform. We also commit to double the media funds for Canada over the 3 next years. And also, we're the first government in our Canadian history to set up a bureau for Aboriginal productions and offer 40 million in the first budget were offered. And we committed to continue with 13 million yearly every year for the Aboriginal. So how do you plan this? Do you have, for example, any documents on the GAFA, and also you have a second parallel discussion that is taking place on the content online? Are there any other parallel projects if you are elected next September 20th? Yes, absolutely. We want to file the other bills on the roles of GAFA in media, equitable compensation. We're talking about Facebook and Google, of course, and we're offering on our platform to inspire ourselves from the Australian model. We have to adapt it. We're not Australia. We cannot really just adopt a model as such over here, but it is a very interesting model nonetheless. So we have to be careful. At times, we're talking about content that is considered as being prejudicial or harmful. We're not talking about contents that are, not the kind of content that we would like, but we would like to have better tools to fight against those harmful and damaging production, the sexual images without any consent from the parties, violence, and so on. So this is under the criminal code. So if physically we cannot do it, there's no reason why we cannot apply this on the virtual side. So yes, so we have 3 minutes to talk about theme number 2, invest in the Canadian talent. How can we assure the promotion of perennial growth and giving more opportunity for Canadian talent under a Canadian perspective? Sorry if I repeat myself, but if we want to modernize the law, well, that generate more than $800 million yearly for the sector. So instead of doing this, we are reducing the funds by more than $1.3 million. So we will not have this if we move ahead with the modernization of the law. So, let's figure out, we'll get like 20 to 25% for Quebec and for other productions throughout the country in French. So, the modernization of the broadcasting law, I cannot see how we can support the next generation of creators because we're going to be facing less and less funds available. So I believe that there is a fundamental difference with the fact that Canada is becoming a production branch for foreign productions. So, we're losing the right to tell our own stories. Yeah. So I do not deny that the fact that we have lots of productions over here have a value in terms of job creation, but it's not the same as being able to tell our own stories, support our own creators. That is, beyond that, I think that there's something that we haven't done too often is to give and use the tools of the BDC, for example, Bank of Development in Canada. And I've talked to the Sorry, I was talking about the Canadian Bank of Development. To dedicate amounts to the art of culture. So it's very difficult for entrepreneurs to find the kind of funding. If the Canadian Bank of Development finances everything, why not the entrepreneurs that we have?
Back to you for the questions in English. For the
Thank
last
you.
2 questions.
Thank you, Patrick. Our fourth theme was supposed to be the environment, but I think that you probably like to talk a bit very deeply about that. It's close to your heart. There is certainly a cleanup that needs to be done in our industry. We have been responsible for a lot of things that shouldn't happen in a climate changing environment to get a green environment. But now I see that people in our industry are very seriously committed to environmental control and to emission control. How can we work with you specifically to make that happen in ways like you suggested the development bank as a way to help the industry? What is out there in your platform that can help us clean up our act?
Thank you for that question. It is one that is also very close to my heart, as is the support and well-being of the arts and culture sector in Canada. One of the things that fascinated me the most when I first started my role as Minister of Canadian Heritage and started meeting people from different sectors of the arts and culture across the country was that the fact that people welcomed me by saying, my goodness, we're so happy to have an environmental activist as heritage minister for the very reasons that you outline. At first, I'm not an art expert. I mean, I'm certainly an enthusiast, but when the Prime Minister asked me to sit around the cabinet table and be the Canadian Heritage Minister, I was certainly honored, but my second thought was, what am I going to do? And clearly, I connected very quickly with so many people because in many ways, artists and environmentalists are very similar. They're very passionate people. They're very dedicated people, and they care deeply about the world we live in. And I think another characteristic that we share is that we don't necessarily see the world for what it is, but we see it for what it could be. Environmentalists in terms of sustainability, and artists in terms of the beauty and every way that sculptures and musicians and arts, other artists see the world. So we started working earlier on in looking how can the federal government accompany the sector in a greening strategy. And shortly before the election was called, I was happy to announce that we had created two advisory committee to the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, one for the greening of the arts and culture, and another one for the greening of the sports sector. And what I'm hoping we will be able to do with this is, one, as you rightly pointed out, there is a growing concern within the sector in terms of the footprint of the sector. And there's already a number of organizations, companies that have started looking at this, what it is we can do in the music, in the audiovisual sector. There are organizations that have developed expertise that they can share. So I want to make sure that these resources are made available, but that also the federal government can help organizations who want to start transitioning to start reducing their environmental and carbon footprint. And the second area where I think we need to collaborate more is that the science of communicating on climate change has evolved a lot over the last few years. And basically what it tells us is that we've been communicating on climate change all wrong. Like, our communications have been based on very complicated things. We've been talking about severe weather events as if it would help, as if it would mobilize people to act. In fact, what we're seeing is that it doesn't mobilize them, it paralyzes them in fear. We've been using really complex concepts like percentages of emission reduction and 2030 and 2050. But what the science tells us is that we should be communicating from the heart. We should be communicating based on values. And I mean, as an activist, I certainly wasn't very good at doing that. I don't think I'm much better as a politician. Artists, on the other hand, are very good at doing this. And they have a way of doing this that no one else can do. And that's another thing that I've discovered over the last 18 months is how many artists and arts organizations are out there who want to be part of this conversation on climate change to help Canadians understand that we're all in this together. We all have a role to play, and certainly government have a very important role. And I'm not trying to put this on the public's shoulder. We have an important role to play, but we're all in this together, and we have together to find solutions and to work together. And I think artists can play a key role in helping us do that.
Thank you. A greening economy a greening world is a world that finds diversity precious. And human diversity is another thing that we wanted to talk to you about. Stories that are told by people who live them and who know them and understand both the funny parts and the difficult parts of their background. How can you work with us to make sure that these diverse voices have a chance, become part of our strength as content creators?
That's another really good question. And I will brag a little bit, but I'm very proud of what we've accomplished and what I have accomplished as Canadian Heritage Minister. the creation and funding of the Indigenous Screen Office, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. There's another really important thing we did when the pandemic hit, and we came up with the first tranche of emergency funding, the $500 million in the spring of 2020. We realized that there's a number of organizations we weren't speaking to. And without support from the federal government, these organizations would have a really hard time, and most of them probably wouldn't be able to make it through the pandemic. So we set aside 40% of the emergency funding to go to organizations that we at Canadian Heritage or the Canada Council or the Canada Media Fund or Telefilm, 40% organization that had never received funding from the federal government. First thing that it did, it made us realize there was a lot of people out there we weren't talking to, and we needed to change that. And we've made that now part of our programming, of our existing program funding. The other thing we started doing is who do we choose to represent the voices of Canadians on Canadian institutions? The nomination of Jesse Wente as head of the Canada Council for the Arts, the nomination of Aisha Khan as head of the Canadian Human Rights Museum, Mohamed Hashim as head of the Canadian Race Relation Foundation. So as a minister responsible for Canadian Heritage, I oversaw the nomination of roughly 200 people in different government positions, crown corporations over the last 18 months. 30% of them self-identified as being BIPOC, 10% of them as Indigenous people, and 56%, 57% as women. And I think this is really key. Like, we can't keep nominating white guys over 50 in these key positions and hope that the decisions that are made are any different than the decisions that have been made over the last few decades. So this is a key element, I think. And perhaps the last thing I would want to say is we need to make a bigger place for diverse creators and storytellers within the CBC. CBC is a very powerful tool that we have in Canada, and I want to reaffirm the role of the public broadcaster in protecting and promoting diversity, and also French language and Francophone cultures in Quebec, but also across the country, and also to ensure that Indigenous voices and cultures are present on our screens and radios. And we are also committing to help the public broadcaster do that, to increase the CBC's budget by $400 million within the next 4 years.
Isn't that, as I recall your platform, not $400 million, and this is in response to a question that we have here, is mainly to get rid of ads, not to increase programming. Is that correct or not?
Well, it's a combination of things, but yes, we want to diminish ads for certain segment of what the CBC publishes, but we also want some of this money to be used to increase the diversity of the voices, of the stories that we see and hear on the CBC.
Are you critical of what the CBC has done so far in diversity?
No, that's really not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that we want to see more diversity. We need to help the CBC have more resources to be able to do it.
Well, thank you, Minister. You've really been very helpful in your answers.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
So our next candidate is from the Conservative Party, and Kevin Waugh. We're delighted to see you here.
Thank you.
We are both alumni of CTV. Only you had the great job, sports journalist. How much fun was that for you?
Very fun. Until, funny you said that, until TSN started. Because each station along the CTV network then lost a staff member to get TSN up and running. So, you know, the local sports suffered badly in this country. I mean, TSN has been very good for Bell Media, but on the same token, you know, the broadcasting industry locally has really suffered with the national voice. And I'll give you an example. When I left CTV Saskatoon, when I was elected in 2015, they've dropped their sports. We used to have a 6-minute newscast, sports at 6, and then at 11 o'clock, you know, I would have up to 9 or 11 minutes. Well, they don't have that anymore. So that tells you where the state of broadcasting is in this country. It's all centralized in Toronto. The decisions are made at head offices. And who's suffering? Well, it is coast to coast. We saw it in the pandemic when CBC cut the only newscast of Prince Edward Island during the pandemic last year. And then we're forced to bring it back because people cherish local news. That's all we have. I mean, as you know, Trina, you've been in broadcasting a long time. It's deteriorated to the point now that a lot of Canadians don't get their news anymore from the traditional media outlets. And we've suffered for that in this country, in my opinion.
So just let's start with one of the themes, and maybe you can talk about what you've just been talking about, the local news. And that is, how can we strengthen our product, our content, our creation, how we can get to be at a higher level now, at a higher level soon than we are now. What does your party say about that?
Well, let me start to say there is a tremendous appetite for local news in every region in this country. Tremendous appetite. And at times, Facebook has filled the void because local newscasts have been reduced. The industry that I feel the most for right now is radio. Many stations have gone dark in this country. Others only are, you know, they come on at 6 in the morning and then leave at 6 p.m. and the rest is satellite radio. So when you're driving or doing something at night, it's always quarter to the hour. Well, which hour is it? Well, we don't know because somebody has taped this, and you know, the stations across the country and radio are picking up on this. And we're not developing any talent anymore in radio. You know, the schools that used to produce fantastic talent, why would you get into this business? The jobs are disappearing every day, coast to coast. Stations are going dark. And there doesn't seem to be a footprint in this country to help out not only radio, but television and, more importantly, newspaper. But we're not here tonight to talk about the newspaper industry, which has maybe suffered the most. You know, we were not really against Bill C-10. I know that this modernization of the Broadcast Act had to happen. Let's face it, it's 30 years plus old. We never had internet when it first came out. Things have changed now. Canadians want to get their news immediate. And we were fully supportive of C-10, but there is some caveats to this. Many in my business of broadcasting have reservations about the CRTC, which is the regulator of many of the broadcasting stations in this country. In fact, all of them. This bill, C-10, gave way too much power to the CRTC. I have talked about newscasts coming out of Winnipeg that service the Saskatoon market, where the anchor is actually from Winnipeg, and we're seeing local news. That has never been disputed by the CRTC. After the stations got their license, they kind of walked away, came back 5 to 7 years later, rubber stamped it, and moved on. So when you're watching television now, you wonder where the anchors are from. Trina, some of our newscasts in Saskatchewan are from Toronto. The weather is from Toronto. The newscaster is from Winnipeg. That's not my Main Street, Saskatchewan. I know better than that because I've been in the business. You can't fool me. You can't fool the public. And when we see the deterioration of the announcers who used to be the spokesman for the local radio TV stations diminish coast to coast, there is a serious problem that we have with broadcasting. Unfortunately,
so besides the CRTC, is that the deal? Too much power?
Yeah, way too much power.
Too much regulation?
Way too much regulation. We've heard this time and time again. And then there's the order in council, where cabinet can decide for themselves what to approve. Well, that should never be, even if we were government. And, you know, we have a heritage minister who makes the decision, order in council. That's not the way this should run. So, you know, the CRTC has run its course in this country, in my opinion. I've been a long-time broadcaster, over 4 decades. There's been some good points with the CRTC. There's been some horrible points. The mergers of stations, where we see now Shaw and Rogers, and there's silence in this country about the merger that could take place next year. We should have a dialogue with people on this very issue. There are job losses. I don't care what happens. If Rogers goes to Shaw or Shaw goes to Rogers, whatever the deal is, it's millions and billions of dollars at the end of the day, but yet Canadians are going to be shortchanged in that inevitably to pay for the merger, it will be less production, less broadcasting. And that's where Canadians have frustrated themselves. And that's why they've turned to the giants like Facebook to get their information.
So can you be a little more specific about what would replace the CRTC and what regulations you would like to see dropped?
Well, the license fees were a good example of dropping. I think that was a good move because right now, you know, we know the pressures on local television and radio stations in this country is immense. So that was a very good decision. There should be consultation with the owners of each station. What we have now, Trina, as you know, is the big get bigger. The radio stations are being gobbled up by conglomerates. They're no longer owned by 1 or 2 people. It's, you know, 3 or 4 groups owning several stations throughout the country. So I think we need some guidelines, clear guidelines going forward. You know, we're going to replace them maybe with legislation that updates the Broadcasting Act that to deal with the realities of an increasingly online market and the need to provide businesses with certainty and consumers with choice. And I'll give you an example in this election. Very few of us have bought any TV time. Maybe the national parties did. But there was a time as a candidate, you would have taken out a 15 or 30-second spot ad. Well, very few of us can A, afford that. B, we don't know how many viewers that particular station has. You know, in my case in Saskatoon, we had thousands of viewers. I'm not too sure anymore around the newscast how many are viewing in. So, you know, so where do you put your money? And radio's the same. Streaming has taken over. We require large digital streaming services like the Netflixes, the Disney Pluses, and Amazon Video to reinvest in this country. We have seen a deterioration of what this country was made on, and that's democracy with the media leading the way. And journalism in this country right now is an all-time low and is getting lower because the affordability for stations to carry out local media broadcasts is soon evaporating in every market in this country.
Well, you know, you and I could have a good talk about this, but I think this audience actually is not necessarily journalists. And to go to our second theme, what about Canadian talent and Canadian stories and making sure that they have a place in both our streaming services and our broadcasting organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question because Canadians we have seen worldwide don't need to take a back seat to anybody. You know, in this province, I'll just share with you corner gas.
Yes.
Probably corner gas today is more popular than when it first came out with the reruns. And here we have in Saskatchewan, the government of the day decided to end tax credits. So our production house, a wonderful facility in Regina, is no longer used. Rollo, Saskatchewan, we have people coming from all over the world. Where's Rollo? I've seen the show, I want to see it. So, you know, Canadians have to invest. I really believe, Trina, Canadians are willing to invest in Canadian businesses. And I think, you know, a lot of people in the pandemic, and we've seen that the last 15 months, there's a lot of money tucked away. We have to tap people on the shoulder and say, look, we got to tell our stories. We have tremendous television and audio people in this country. We have more opportunities today than we've ever had at telling our stories. You know, I looked at APTN when they came on board. They filled a void in this country. And we should be ashamed of ourselves because, you know, at the same time, we have a great public broadcaster in CBC. But obviously, I watch a lot of APTN. I watch their newscasts. I watch their stories. That was a void that was filled by the company in Winnipeg, and they have satellite people across the country. And, you know, we must do a better job, I think, on the public broadcaster. And I heard there's 400 million going to the CBC. But at the same time, we've got to ask, what's it being used for? I'm very critical when CBC signed the deal after losing Hockey Night in Canada to just give the 6 hours away to Rogers. Be innovative. Help our creators. That 6 hours from 6 o'clock Saturday night to midnight, which used to be Hockey Night in Canada, and they lost the contract to Rogers, that could have been used to share Canadian stories, to reach out to Canadian companies. Nobody cares about the ratings in CBC. It's not there for the ratings. It's there to give us Canadian culture. And I was very disappointed when they decided that Hockey Night in Canada can resume because we've had it for a long time, when really what they should have done is made those 6 hours on Saturday night the Canadian culture and share with Canadian producers across this country.
I think they would have loved to do that, but it was not exactly within their budget. Let's talk a little bit again about the fourth theme, which is diversity and the idea of Canada's strength. And are we exploiting that strength? Maybe exploiting is a bad word to use, but are we using that strength? Are we using those people of talent who have new stories and interesting stories to tell the country?
Very good question. I think we need more Indigenous stories, certainly with the Truth and Reconciliation when it came through the country in 6 and 7 years, and certainly now with the unmarked graves in this province and in the country. It was a shocking discovery for many of our young viewers here tonight watching this about the unmarked graves. I knew about it. I was a school board trustee. We were educated on that. So the diversity in this country needs to be told more, not only for Indigenous groups, but others that are coming to this country. One of the big changes I've seen as a broadcaster is the podcast. It's pretty easy now to listen to a podcast. And, you know, former broadcasters have moved into the podcast, others have. That is a way that I think has filled the void in this country. Many people now in this country really enjoy the podcast. It's uninterrupted with commercials, usually. It's 40 minutes or an hour, whatever the case may be. So podcasts, again, has come with innovation, which we need. And, you know, I think Canada can innovate. And if we get more innovation, it will just give those in our communities a chance to tell their stories. We have a wonderful Sikh community here in Saskatoon. We have a wonderful Ahmadiyya. You know, with Zoom, there's one thing that came out of the pandemic. We could all of a sudden take part in festivals on Zoom. We learned we didn't have to be there in person, where you could maybe take part in a Ukrainian church or share with the Ahmadiyyas or other organizations in this country. So, you know, there was some benefits with the COVID. You know, it did bring us around with innovation again, and that we have to use a little more to get everyone in this country to feel accepted and work on the diversity.
And now, by the way, I can tell from the way you talk that you are a great broadcaster.
Thank you for that.
Patrick, you want to talk to our colleague or our participant about the issues of climate change and
Oui, effectivement. Alors, j'ai une question pour vous. La question...
Yes, indeed. I would have a question for you regarding the environment. At what point it is important for your party, and how could we conciliate this with tax credit for production, greener production? How do you consider that we may have green production, carbon neutrality, and a greater respect for our environment?
Well, I think when we started today, there was a reference to we could do better from the Directors Guild of Canada and of course ACTRA, knowing that there has been issues in the past, not so much environment friendly. And that's the first step. We've acknowledged that. I heard that tonight before you talked to the minister that we could do better with ACTRA, which I once was a member, by the way. And so that's a start. You know, that we realize things have changed. We want a greener economy. The national climate strategy is based on measurable targets. We got to hit our targets, first of all, and we have to work with the provincial government. Some governments are on, some governments provincially are not on base with the federal government. We have to address those issues firsthand. But you're right. When Netflix comes to Vancouver and does a shoot, and then 5, 8, 10 months later, they show how beautiful Canada is, we want to make sure the world sees how beautiful we are. So we have an obligation, not only as parliamentarians, but as ACTRA, as Directors Guild of Canada, to have that image of what we want to see portrayed Canada to the world.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We're going to switch now to Martin Champoux. Martin Champoux, qui est le candidat du Bloc québécois pour Drummond au Québec. Donc pour
Martin
le Bloc
Champoux is representing the Bloc québécois in Quebec. Good evening, good evening. You heard the promises of Mr. Guilbeault earlier. What do you think about this and about the different projects? For example, the horrendous content that may be out there and renewing the act. What do you say? So it will be a pleasure for me to answer your question. First of all, with respect to the commitment that the minister has announced, I believe that he's being a bit late with what he's saying here. And many of my colleagues from different parties share this with me, this opinion. Liberals do things too late and they only go halfway. That's what they do. So let's talk about Bill C-10 because I rapidly want to go over this, but also on the different topics that it is discussed about. We talked about this quite often, and on the crisis of written media. There was supposed to be around March this spring some modifications. They're saying things, and I believe that they are in good faith. But when we talk about what they table, well, it's a different thing altogether. The Bill C-10 is a good intention, and they've been in power since 2015. And when we wanted to modernize this act, it had to be modernized urgently. It's nothing new when we're talking about the industry, the media. Everyone was agreeing and saying that we had to take a look at all of the progress that went through and digital and so on. But when they came in 2020, it was having a canvas, for example, but empty, nothing protected in their bill, the Francophone content and official languages, including Aboriginal languages and so on. So yes, when I hear the minister talking about the commitments of the Liberal Party, I agree with him. I believe that it is important that we set things right, but it could have been done earlier more completely so. So regarding Bill C-10, you will not be surprised if you saw the work by the Heritage Committee. You will see that I was disappointed to the result of Bill C-10. It came too late. And of course, our conservatory colleagues, the filibuster that took place because of the strange interpretation of one of the provisions of the law. We have worked very hard towards that modernization within the industry and the media. Everybody in Quebec wanted the modernization to be done properly, that is. So it was an enormous disappointment when we saw this didn't go through. So the Bloc Québécois wants to make sure that in the next government there will be another bill that will take up from where we got and put all of the work, and I believe that there's a lot of work to be done into modernizing this act. So I believe that it is more urgent now than when it was tabled in November last. What do you offer from the Bloc Québécois in that sector more concretely? Well, when studying Bill C-10, we brought about many amendments and modifications like valuing the content and having a digital platform. So we wanted people on the digital platform to take advantage of that, but you know, not against the participation of people. You know, people in our sector, like in the broadcasting sector, we have to be helped. I believe that we have not set a regulation that renders our market equitable. It is a nonsense that this has not been performed yet. Even at the beginning of the years 2000, everyone agreed that, you know, in broadcasting would be completely changed by the arrival of digitalization. So we failed to regulate that sector, even though everyone was saying that this would be a major change. We should have regulated that and, you know, have done the necessary legislative work towards that. So this protection of the Francophone content, the protection of Quebec content and the Canadian content here must include the amendment that we brought forth, which were not that popular. We had to fight with Liberal and conservatories because we wanted to force the digital platforms to promote the content of people from over here, the directors from over here. We choose a very valuable content. So it makes no sense that there's nothing that was set forth yet. So we only have 2 minutes to talk about theme number 2, invest in talent. You know that we lack manpower in Quebec and Canada currently. How could we support the film industry? Well, first of all, we must realize that we are still going through a crisis, the pandemic. So this has undeniable effect on the entire industry and cultural industry in general. I believe that we should immediately, and I don't want to go through all of these sectors because we're lacking manpower everywhere, and most particularly in Quebec. I believe that all of the programs of assistance were very helpful and generous. And, you know, we must now concentrate this on areas where it is more difficult, more specifically in the cultural setting. So organizations like Telefilm, for example, funding telefilm must be adjusted. We offered and proposed that in the spring, and it was a good thing that it was done. And then we want to see the participation of the federal government in the Canadian funds. And this is a request from our industry. These funds have to be maintained and indexed year after year because the demand is growing, and we want to support the growth also. And we want to support the artists within the industry to continue in audiovisual production, series, films, and everything. We need some proper and relevant funding. And since the funds come from the revenues of cable distributors, so, you know, if they have less money, they're not going to participate as much. And there's a ratio also. The industry saw that there was an inequity in the distributions of the amounts, and we want to readjust this to a ratio of 40-60 instead of 30-70. So we want to fix a floor at $300 million at the Arts Council. So, you know, we're all well positioned over here to see that, you know, costs continue increasing. We are going to increase the power of production of our creators. So that's all for our French question.
So I'd like to talk to you, Mrs. Shampoo, about the diversity issue. Quebec has done a wonderful job in telling its own stories, in its depiction of its history, its stars, its comedians. Everyone loves the broadcasting area in Quebec. Audiences are high. How can you replicate this success with people who are not Quebecois, who are Indigenous particularly, or from other countries? What room is there for their stories, would you say?
Je vous dirais qu'il y a beaucoup de réponses à cette question-là.
I would tell you that many answers to those questions would be found in the Bill C-10. If I understood properly your question, in Bill C-10, there were provisions making sure that all groups would be represented, the diversity would be well represented, the real state, social, and demographics of Quebec would be better represented in the broadcasting industry in Quebec. So when we're talking about the modernization of this bill or act that we had, how can we see people that are not Canadian be represented in this industry? So first of all, the productions, to use an expression that Mrs. Yale used in one of our meetings, it should be the mirror of the society in which we evolve. So I believe that this is where the answer is, rather than the quotas or allocations or so on. We have to make sure that what we see in our production is representative in the society in which we're living, and that it be an opened society.
And our last theme is the theme of the environment and the role of our sector in having a green society. What do you think the obligations that the industry has? What are they? And how do you think that you can help in politics to achieve those?
The problem
is we have to know where, you know, we have to, and how we have to take a look at the problem. We have to take a look at it from top down. So I believe that one of the first things is, how may I say, let's free ourselves from the addiction that we have for fossil, for fuel, and let's establish some goals for carbon neutrality, and we could go ahead towards these goals that we set, and we can have measures and positions.
We voted in favor of Bill C-12 in the Bloc Québécois because they agree with the 2050 carbon neutral goal. However, we believe that it is not a goal in and of itself to set an objective. We need to equip ourselves and adopt the tools and means and objectives, and often it's restrictive to set such objectives. So I think that's what's lacking now. We have a good objective, wonderful words, a good project. We're going to reduce greenhouse gas by 2030, 2040, 2050. That's all very well, but in concrete terms, we're really giving ourselves serious tools to meet those objectives. I think that's where it should start, by starting from the top down to make changes and to move away from fossil fuels and make a green transition. Starting from that point, should we bring in incentives for audiovisual production? For example, should we say that if they're carbon neutral, they could have a tax credit for productions? Or, for example, another example, the Bloc Québécois proposes a climate test for all legislation voted in the House of Commons. They should go through a climate test to make sure it does not have an impact on our greenhouse gas reduction goals and achieving carbon neutral status in 2050. The same model could be used for organizations, for productions, or for any applicants for subsidies from federal programs. So there are models like this which we could perhaps apply, but I think the first thing we need to do is stop beating around the bush and set objectives for which we do not equip ourselves or restrict ourselves in any way to be sure we achieve them. At one point, as we say, you know, walk the talk.
Well, that's a good statement from a politician, I must say. So last question from the audience. We have time for that, and that is the question about Radio-Canada and its future as far as the Bloc is concerned.
Ma foi, c'est une question très large.
Well, it's a very broad question. If you want to talk about the future of Radio-Canada, personally, I think that our public broadcaster is an essential component of our broadcasting landscape. Are there things to be reviewed in the current format of Radio-Canada? Certainly. I would be fully agreeing with a discussion about that. I was surprised that there was nothing or virtually nothing about Radio-Canada in Bill C-10, because, as I said, Radio-Canada is a major aspect in our broadcasting landscape, and I expected to see certain proposals appearing, but that was not the case. However, I think there's certainly a reflection process and a lot of discussion that we ought to have. Some say, for example, that we should review the financing model for Radio-Canada. Certain proposals were put forward, for example, no longer offer public financing for news broadcasts and keep it for variety broadcasters, all sorts of other ideas circulating around. But if you want to ask me about the future of our public broadcaster, I think we should protect this resource because it's an important component of our broadcasting system.
Protect and encourage. In other words, does it have the funding that it needs to do the job that you're asking of it?
Ce n'est pas une question à laquelle je peux vous fournir une réponse.
It's not a question I can really give you an answer to specifically today. I think there may be things that ought to be examined in greater depth. Some might say that Radio-Canada receives too much financing. Others would say it needs more. We'll have to take a look at the needs and the real expectations from our public broadcaster. And it's not up to me to answer that. I think that every stakeholder has the right to pronounce themselves on that. And in my opinion, there's a much more complex and in-depth question to debate than just asking me what I think about the financing levels for Radio-Canada, whether it's too much or not enough.
Well, you're quite correct that it is a very complex question, and thank you for pointing that out, It's not simple. Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci à
Merci,
vous.
M. Champeau.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Champeau.
And Heather McPherson, welcome, and thank you for coming here. You know, listening to this, I have to ask you a question that isn't on the theme. This is your first term in Parliament, correct?
It is, yes.
Did it surprise you that they can't seem to get anything done?
I assume you're talking about C10.
Well, I'm talking about just, you know, you name it. It seems to be so difficult to, every one of you in some ways agrees on what you want for our sector. But
So
it just doesn't seem to be able to get done. And now when I see all these mandate reviews that are being proposed of the CRTC, the CBC, et cetera, I just wonder whether we will have time to take advantage of the opportunity that we have in a world that's crying out for content creation. Will we ever be able to get a kind of realistic proposal that all parties will agree to?
Well, it's a great question. And first of all, I want to thank you all for letting me join you today. I'm on Treaty 6 territory, and it's a delight to be here. It's nice to be here with my colleagues from the Heritage Committee. I can answer the question writ large. As a new parliamentarian, I can say that this was a unique parliament to be elected into, of course. With COVID-19, the fact that we were able to get supports out so fast to people, the fact that we were able to, I'm the deputy House leader in addition to being the deputy heritage critic, and the supports we were able to get out was really quite rapid. I was really proud of what the NDP was able to do to ensure that some of those supports went out to Canadians. So on one hand, I think in 2020, we saw the best of what government can be when it works together, and when we collaborate and when we all pull in the same direction, and when the goal is to help Canadians. The goal is to make sure all Canadians prosper and can succeed and can be safe and healthy and productive. So that's the best case scenario. And so I'm really happy I can start with the positive. The other scenario, of course, we alluded to it a lot in this conversation so far. It was on C10, and it was unbelievably stressful and unbelievably disappointing. I'm a highly impatient person by nature. I don't know if it's my Scottish heritage or what makes me that way, but I found I would spend so many days speaking to people within the sector, to speaking with people within the broadcasting sector that, small, medium creators, the broadcasters themselves, the small radio stations in different areas of the country. And the one thing we heard from everyone is that the legislation that was brought forward, the C10, needed to be fixed, and that it was so late and so delayed, and that they would rather have flawed legislation than no legislation, because we were so late to the game getting something together. So knowing that there was this urgency, knowing that there was this dire need for the sector, of course, it's incredibly disappointing to see that ultimately C10 died, that it was not brought forward soon enough. It was brought forward in November, and certainly I worked as hard as I could, and we sat extra hours, and we tried as hard as we could to move it through the process, through committee and through the House of Commons. I do find it, I'm not going to lie, I do find it incredibly disingenuous. Kevin, you're a good friend of mine, but we all know the Conservatives did not support C10, particularly, I don't know if it was CRTC or when we actually insisted that the web giants be held to account, when we insisted that the web giants actually played on the same playing field, a level playing field. So it's very frustrating to see that. I'm happy to hear the minister say that they will be reintroducing C10 legislation within the first 100 days of the next parliament. I certainly hope that some of the important work that was done at the committee to fix C10 is incorporated into that new legislation, and that we can move it through the process very, very fast and get it to the Senate. The worst case scenario would be that we kick this can down the road for another 2 years and end up, losing it again. So I'm urging all of the parties, and I know for the New Democrats, we will do whatever we can to get this updated broadcasting legislation in place.
So one of the things that I think people think is this is our best chance ever to have a thriving, creative industry that will not only do things inside the country, but we will be seen around the world. What do you think that politicians need from our sector to make things happen?
Well, I mean, I think the sector has been incredibly productive, incredibly giving with politicians. You know, I myself, as I mentioned, met with hundreds of people to talk about C10 legislation and how it could be improved. We all know that while we sat in committee, you know, and debated the amendments, the very numerous amendments that were brought forward by all five parties, including the government itself, that you know, you were all watching, you were all helping us draft those amendments and whatnot. What I valued the most about the C10 conversation is actually listening to those of you within the sector, listening to people and trying to find ways to make sure that we were doing those things that were so important, that we were leveling the playing field, you know, that we were protecting language minority rights in Quebec and outside of Quebec. You know, I'm in Edmonton, Strathcona. It is where the French Quarter in Alberta is located. We have French broadcasters in Edmonton, Strathcona that are trying to ensure that the French language across the country is protected. And I will fight tooth and nail, despite my inability to fight tooth and nail in French, for that to continue. You know, we heard from the broadcasters, we heard from the sector, and that's who we need to listen to. That's what the gift that we got from your sector, and that we'll continue to hear. And we need to take that information and make sure the legislation is better.
So your advice tonight is keep at it, keep doing it, and do it more.
Yeah, and you know what? I guess what you need to do is encourage people within your sector to recognize that elections matter, and there is one in 2 weeks. Elections matter because you need to elect somebody who will move this forward, who will fight for artists, will fight for the cultural sector, will fight for the broadcasting sector. That won't fight. You know, we don't want another situation where the web giants are allowed to get away with whatever they like. You know, when we don't hold the web giants to account, when we don't include them in our broadcasting legislation, it's the equivalent of subsidizing them. So we're subsidizing these foreign web giants at the expense of our local media, at the expense of our local broadcasters, and that's utterly wrong.
So the continuing question in the sector is why, when Canada obviously has so much talent, has such a gift of storytelling, do so many Canadians have to go to work in the United States or in England? How can you help us make that not the case?
Well, I think we need to invest in our creators. You know, we need to make sure that it is, because you're absolutely right, Trina. The stories that Canadians tell, the stories about Canadians, made by Canadian writers, Canadian producers, you know, the post-production happening in Canada is vital. And we do amazing work. You know, we all have examples of amazing production that's happened in Canada, in Alberta, you know, in each of our communities. So we already know that the capacity is there, the skill is there, the talent is there. But you're right, we have a massive neighbor next door, and we need to live with that reality. We need to invest in our sector. We need to make sure that we are investing in, you know, whether that be the National Film Board, whether that be CBC, so that they can do more of that content creation and ensure that those stories are still being told. There's a lot of different ways that we can make sure that we're promoting and working with the sector. Now, I said it with C10, and I'll say it again for this question. The most important thing is that we are listening to broadcasters and creative creators, that we are listening to writers, we are listening to producers, so that we are helping them in the way that they need to be helped, whether those are tax credits, whether that is additional investment in things like the NFB and CBC, telefilm, the media funds. All of those things need to be on the table, but they need to be things that are being developed in collaboration with the sector, not separate from the sector.
So you're saying, I think, something that is very important. And I think that I wanted to ask you just to go into a little more of what you said about how the institutions and the independent companies, businesses can work together. We have telefilm, we have CBC, we have various funds and so on. And we also have profit-making companies who want to get out there and make money out of what they do. What's the relationship between those two, or is there?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think I see that many of our institutions like CBC, Radio Canada, like the Canada Media Fund, the NFB, a lot of those are great opportunities for us to tell Canadian stories, and ensure that we have the stories from our queer communities, from our BIPOC communities, from Indigenous communities, from communities whose stories may not be promoted and privileged as much. Now, I think there's ways that we can encourage the private sector to do that as well. But these are those spaces where we can ensure that that's happening, where we can really make sure that that's the case. I think we have a great opportunity right now, and I really, like you, hope that we don't miss the opportunity. We know COVID-19 was unbelievably hard on the broadcasting sector. It was incredibly hard on our writers, our production teams. And we also know that they were amongst the first industries to sort of feel the real cuts of it, and maybe one of the last ones to recover fully. We were all very, very proud of how the industry pivoted during COVID-19 to keep Canadians safe, to keep themselves safe, to continue on with production. But I think this opportunity and time means that we should be envisioning what it looks like going forward. We have a bit of a restart button. So let's put together a arts and culture industry package, a rebuilding package that will support the industry, that will help people recover, help the industry recover from the pandemic, but will also set us up to be more modern, be more future looking. I mean, the sector itself is, our funding mechanisms are not.
Good point. Okay, Patrick.
Oui, Madame McPherson, sur la question de l'environnement, où se situe le nouveau Parti démocratique?
On the environmental question, Ms. McPherson, where does the NDP stand on that, and how could that work in order to improve things, for example, in Canada's broadcasting industry? What would you see as a measure that we could choose in order to have a more carbon neutral landscape? Would it be by tax credits, for example, or what kinds of programs would the NDP promote for audiovisual production and greening it in Canada?
Well, again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. I think this is another opportunity where we speak to the sector and we find those ways that will work within what the sector is doing. I think that earlier on we had heard the sector has a great desire to move into an environmentally carbon neutral space. So what is the best way to do that? How do we reward those productions that are being more carbon neutral and that are being more thoughtful about their impacts on the environment? What would that look like? I think that is something that you talk to the sector about and develop the strategies that way. There's another thing, though, that I think is really important, that we have an opportunity with our broadcasting sector, with our arts and culture sector, to tell stories about greening that I think we also need to be considering, telling the stories about climate change, the impacts of climate change on populations, on Canadians around the country. I think there's also something there to be said about, the storytelling that we do, that holding that mirror up, is such an important role. It's such an important way for us to get Canadians talking about the climate crisis, get people acting on it. I would love to see a credit program. I would love to see us be able to do something with the sector, but I'll listen to the sector and find out what from them is the most useful. Now my other complaint, and I'm going to get a little bit political here, is that frankly, you know, what I'm hearing from some of the other parties is that they're very interested in this and they're very keen on you know, hitting these targets and whatnot. But we've always had targets in Canada and we have never met them. So it is also that next step of making sure that regardless of what we say in our election platforms and our campaigns, that we actually follow through and meet those targets that we set for ourselves. And that holds true to the sector as well. You know, the sector needs to set targets and meet those targets, and they need to be supported to do that, because of course we know there are costs in that transition, there are costs in changing the way that we do things, and they need to be supported to do that.
Vous pensez donc qu'il y a un peu d'hypocrisie de la part du gouvernement?
And we know also that the Liberal government is being a hypocrite on that, on the fact that, you know, they're saying that their goals are reached, but they're not really in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, we have the highest G7, you know, we're highest in the G7 for our carbon output. We've not met any of our targets. We're still subsidizing oil and gas. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We need as government, or as, you know, parliamentarians, we need to walk the walk as well. Listen, I feel like I'm at the end and I'm taking pock shots, but we have a party that doesn't even acknowledge climate change is real through and through. So that's a bigger problem. And then we have a government that hasn't met their climate targets and talks but doesn't walk. You know I'm in a very privileged position, because the NDP have never been government, so we have never been held to our record. That said, as opposition, my role is to poke a little bit at the failures of some of my colleagues, I think. So I hope they forgive me.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant passer à la discussion.
Thank you. Now we'll move to the discussion with Sandy Crowley from the Green Party in Canada. Good evening, Sandy.
I'm trying to unlock my, hello? Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can hear you.
I'm trying to unlock my video. Okay, start my video. Here we go. Okay, here we are.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much for including me in this important conversation.
Comment vous situez-vous au Parti vert du Canada?
You, as a Green Party of Canada, how do you position yourself with respect that what was done by the Liberals, the failure of Bill C-10, and the announcements made by the Minister Guilbeault to eventually increase the budget of CBC, and the content and line, everything here? What is your position? And then we could perhaps talk about the program of the Green Party in order to improve the audiovisual sector in Canada.
Indeed. C-10 was certainly a step in the right direction. It was very disappointing that the Conservative Party blocked it on specious grounds, free speechism, please, thank you. Sounded like Donald Trump. And I have to say that the minister, I'm sorry, I'm late coming to this particular event, so I didn't hear what Monsieur Guilbeault said this evening, but I think he was on the right track. I think his party let him down. It was too late, as some of my colleagues have pointed out. C-10 and regulation, taxation, curbing the web giants is absolutely necessary. It's late. A lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. We're always playing catch up with the technology that comes across the border. But C-10 was a good step, and the work of the Heritage Committee. Thank you, Ms. McPherson and your colleagues on the Janet Yale report. It gave us a lot of good clues. The copyright reform, which Harper's reform, which wreaked so much damage to our publishing sector, to our writers and so on. I mean, the whole sector needs more support, but certainly the audiovisual sector needs more support. So the Green Party, which is not likely to form the government believes that much more money can be invested in public broadcasting. As you know, we're 9th in the developed world per capita funding for public broadcasting, which is just crazy. So we think, I typed it into the Q&A, we think that we ought to give the CBC about $2 billion a year and guarantee that for 5 years so that they don't have to sell advertising, that they can start working to fulfill a mandate that includes native languages, indigenous languages, and so on. I mean, there's a lot of work for the public broadcaster to do, and it needs much more support, as the whole sector does. So I can take it apart a little further than that if you wish, but that's my first volley in terms of C10. It was a step in the right direction. We've got to recognize the courage of the Australians and some of the Europeans in standing up to the hegemony of the the American cultural machine, the so-called cultural machine. So and the audiovisual sector should be doing a lot better. We've always been up against distribution. We've always been disadvantaged through distribution, and the web giants are just the latest tool that's been used to swamp us with content that we can't compete with because we don't invest enough money in it, public money.
Qu'est-ce que vous feriez de différent dans les prochains mois?
What would you do differently in the months to come for the reform of the CRTC? And how do we go farther with copyrights from GAFA and the law for the harmful content? And what would you say? How could we reform the CRTC?
The CRTC, as far as I'm concerned, has the powers. They only exempted the internet. They didn't say, oh, we're never going to touch the internet. It's a complex matter in terms of trying to address misinformation and all of that. The havoc that's been reaped by not having appropriate regulation of online content. But I certainly disagree with my colleague from the Conservative Party who suggested the CRTC's course is run. We need the CRTC, we need the Competition Bureau, and we need the Copyright Board. And actually, they need to work in tandem with each other. In terms of copyright, I've long agreed with the position of the Directors Guild that directors should have authorship. I know the producers who are listening in won't be happy to hear us say that, but that's my opinion. There are many things in copyright reform. For instance, in visual arts, there should be the right of resale, which is well established elsewhere in the world. There's no reason not to have that sort of thing. There's a much broader, I think Ms. McPherson was hinting at, there's a much broader strategy across the sector, not just for the audiovisual sector. We need to work together. But in terms of copyright, the Harper so-called reforms, modernization, did more harm than good in publishing, for instance. I know because I was working there. And there's no reason why Canada's film and television and audiovisual sector can't be as distinguished in the world as our novelists are if we have the correct strategies and policies and legislation in place to make sure that we can get our content, we can support good content creation. We have the talent, everyone has said that, there's no question about that. We don't have the resources. We haven't invested the resources, and it's not going to come from the private sector. Somebody was suggesting that private money should now save the AV sector. That's not going to happen,
Le thème numéro 2, c'est investir dans le talent canadien.
Theme number 2 is invest into Canadian talent. You know that we lack severely manpower in Canada. How can we support the film industry in Canada being in this context?
I don't think we lack manpower in terms of people who are willing to work in an industry. If the industry isn't supported and doesn't have sufficient resources, then people will naturally be drawn to the magnets of Hollywood or Great Britain, where they can in fact take part in more, you know, in greater supported production. But we don't have any lack of talent. We just lack the investment. There's plenty of talent here. We've proven that. I mean, you know, you can't get a crew in Vancouver or Halifax because American producers are coming up and hiring the people to do it. The DGC knows this very well. There's no lack of talent. It's just a lack of investment.
Merci. Thank you. Back to Trina for the last two questions.
Just wanted to, when you talk about investment, are you kind of likening the industry right now to a group of startups who have lots of, well, you know, because there is something in that, there are so many now entrepreneurs in the business. What do you think about that?
I think in the independent production sector is the key to our success. I don't think that the public broadcaster should be supported in order to produce a whole lot of drama, a whole lot of documentary, a whole lot of children's programming. I think that the public broadcaster, for instance, and the private broadcaster should learn not to bid up the cost of American product instead of investing in independent producers here. But it's independent production that is the key to our success, and it's proven itself. Certainly in Quebec, it's quite obvious, but it's obvious everywhere. You know, I mean, it's a strange irony to me that one of the big stars in the documentary sector, which I have some experience with, is Ken Burns, who would never have been a producer if he hadn't seen the early work of Colin Lowe and so on at the National Film Board. So, you know, I mean, we have a gold mine. If you look at the National Archives, Library and Archives, if you look at the actual footage that is sitting there, we could be telling the most amazing stories with an historical perspective. That's just one form of documentary. There's no lack of talent. It's just a lack of investment. The entrepreneurs are the key to it. I think the web giants, should be encouraged to invest in that. They've got so much money. Let's set up an arm's length, not-for-profit mechanism to fund independent producers who can sell their stuff all over the world. There are many stories. We have all the talent. We just need to invest more.
Well, we need to invest more in diversity too. That's one of the things that I don't think the sector can pat itself on the back for all its accomplishments. And when you look around at what's happening with various groups, some of them have been mentioned, the Indigenous grants to Indigenous, different media, the Canadian Media Fund, telefilm. Is this the way to go about it? Is there something that you see that can be done that really encourages people who are not white to tell their stories?
Absolutely.
In a professional way with budgets and crews and all sorts of fripperies like that?
Yeah, I mean, look what Jesse Wente's doing with the fund that he's set up there. Our federal funding agencies have been wrestling with this issue. I know they are. I talked to a number of art service organizations across the sector in live performance, presenters. Everyone is wrestling with this. There is an acknowledgement. Yes, we have to acknowledge a colonial attitude, a systemic racism within the elites that have been making the decisions and so on. The sector actually is ready to wrestle with this. I was encouraged by our NDP colleague there reporting on the good advice she's getting from across the sector. We're quite aware of the problem, and we are wrestling with it. I think the Canada Council is wrestling with it. I think Telefilm and the Canadian Media Fund are wrestling with it, and they need to be supported and resourced in order to do so. It's a struggle, but we're in it, and I think we just have to keep going. I think there's a new and wonderful respect for our Indigenous culture, and that has a lot to do with the climate question, which I hope comes up as well.
Okay, the climate question.
Well,
that was fast.
Well, you know, the primary plank on the platform that the priority plank on the platform that was released today is that every federal agency, of course, we can only lead by example in terms of provincial funding agencies, but every federal agency that funds any kind of production in any medium or genre needs to add an envelope or establish a program that specifically funds creative works that do engage with the climate emergency. I'm sure a number of people here are probably aware of Seth Klein's book, The Good War. You know, we need a government that is, we need to push our government, whoever it may be, in the way that that Mackenzie King was pushed to support the Second World War. It's not a perfect analogy because right now the enemy is much more complicated than just fascism. But we need to fully engage, and it's only our creative sector that's actually going to move the public mind that will push governments. The analog or simile that I've been using when I look at the major parties, I see the NDP coming up and starting to say, yes, we have to get out of fossil fuels finally, and you know, hard targets. The three mainstream parties, unfortunately, my analogy is the house is on fire and they want to put in a new sprinkler system. Let's get serious, people. John Grierson, you know, the reason we had the National Film Board basically was to make propaganda to get Canada into the war. Let's be frank. We need to do something similar. And I don't think we should make any bones about it. I know there are lots of artists who are willing to jump at this. There's amazing creative work going on in the theater and filmmakers and so on who are ready to engage with this and to tell the real story. And that's what we should be doing. We should be funding that.
Through what means? Through what means is that?
Well, the Canada Council, the Telefilm, the Canadian Media Fund, the Canadian Music Fund should all recognize, as we have with BIPOC, with Indigenous, with colonization, with the underserved communities in terms of supporting their creative work. We need to support creative work that engages the public and the artists with the reality that we all face, that our grandchildren are going to choke to death if we don't get busy here.
So Sandy, can I just conclude by asking you, you're among friends here, these are your people. How would you advise them, a question I asked before, to push harder for what they want? What are the means and the opportunities to get our story across? Well,
we have had some pretty strong and united advocacy in the past. I mean, going back to the Massey Commission and the establishment of the Canadian Conference of the Arts and the Canada Council for the Arts and so on. We need to pull together again in that same way. It was too bad when for instance, the Canadian Conference of the Arts faltered and just fell apart. And we used to work together as a sector. I have great respect for Monsieur Guilbeault, and he came to an event that we organized around greening the industry. By the way, you know, all this stuff about greening our own industry, that's tinkering. We have to get serious about it. Only government can do this. Individuals and individual sectors cannot address this climate thing. Anyway, I think we need to keep pushing, and we need to keep finding and hoping that those people who are put in place who actually have the wit to grapple with the files. And I think this minister that we have had in this last Liberal government was probably one of the best we've had in some time. And he was encouraging us to push him. And that's what we have to keep doing. We have to keep talking. We have to keep talking to our clever, very clever civil servants and our political leaders whose ears are open and who are actually recognize the immense value of our creative sector. it becomes more and more important as everything else gets automated.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Much appreciated. Patrick, do you want to, do you have a list of some of the audience questions? I have to reach up here to get them. Maybe we could, okay, here's one. With so much foreign content available, do you see a time when the CBC will be completely Canadian?
It should be now. You know, it's only, I mean, I put it in the Q&A. I've been at this a little too long maybe, but I happen to know that the CBC, I hope this is not the case anymore, but I believe the last time I checked, the CBC had to report to 5 different federal agencies once a year in order to maintain its position and its funding and all of that stuff. It's insane. It's also not given enough money. The amount of extra money that selling advertising, for instance, it's crazy. I mean, it's pocket change in Ottawa compared to what's spent in other things. And it's just, I think it's because politicians don't like to be criticized by a strong, professional, nonpartisan press. But, you know, it's unconscionable. The CBC should be 100% Canadian. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, you know, show a British film or an Australian film or a film from New Zealand or a German film, you know, or a Russian film. But really, they should be predominantly Canadian. And the only reason they're not is because of the lack of resources.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, we have some questions from the audience. I have to reach up inelegantly to see them. Do you have an easier way of seeing the audience questions than I do?
Yes, we have a question for the Conservative Party. Can Mr. Wo address Mr. O'Toole's demand to do away or review the mandate of CBC Radio-Canada?
No, I mean, he's been very clear on CBC Radio-Canada. It is very good media. We've talked about no advertising, but Mr. O'Toole's been very clear. The radio is #1 with CBC. Where we have to have the discussion is with the English CBC television and the web, that they've really done a good job. Unfortunately for CBC, they haven't developed enough web reporters that they're stealing them from every newspaper in the country. They don't produce their own talent to do the web gems. So they're competing against the private industry. I would say their web page is one of the best. I look at it often during the day. They have very good reporting on it. But Mr. O'Toole's been very, very clear. Radio-Canada will stay as it is. It's a very good medium. It's one of the best media that we have in this country. But what's wrong with the television? Why can't we look at CBC English? Do we look at a format of PBS that they have in the United States? I just told you, people are ready to invest in this country. So can we not have that discussion? And you know, I would hope as politicians, we encourage the discussion on a public broadcaster. That's all I'm saying. And Aaron's been very clear on that. Let's see what they're doing. Let's see if they can improve. Heaven knows they don't worry about the ratings. That's not why they're here. So the Conservatives love CBC Radio.
Yes, they do.
We do. We do have an issue with CBC English, not so much CBC French, but English. It can be much better, and we should push it to be better.
It's interesting with what you said about local news. In every market across Canada, CBC Radio is #1.
Mm-hmm. Because they put the money behind it. I guess the only one, Trina, I will say with CBC Radio, should we have the commercials or not? People don't want the commercials on it. It's not very much. You talk about money. It's a very good media without interruptions. And I think it's the #1 choice of many Canadians where they get their information in this country, CBC Radio Canada.
Thank you very much. Patrick, do you have another question from the audience?
Yeah, another for Kevin. You talked a lot about TV and radio. What about members who are involved in film and TV production? Where does the Conservative Party, what's the platform to help the audiovisual sector in Canada?
Yeah, it needs help. It was a very good question. We understand. I mean, we just came through the worst pandemic in the last 15 months, and that industry, it's a $9.3 billion industry in this country. And it's right now on its knees. It needs a little bit of help. Saying that, we would like to see the private sector invest more into this. We are with the Media Fund. We've said that since day one. So there is help for producers. We want to see, great. One of the things that has irritated me more than anything is great documentaries. We don't have that anymore in this country. The green guy mentioned Ken Burns. Great documentaries, and produced by a Canadian, Ken Burns, as you said, Sandy. Unfortunately, documentaries cost a lot of money, and they take a lot of time to produce. And that is where I think I would like to see some CBC stuff. And, the documentaries, there's a big appetite in this country for a great documentary. We've seen it on PBS. People will sit and watch them and donate from Canada to the United States on documentaries. And so, we got to have an open conversation about this. We know the Canadian industry for film in French and Canada and English needs help. I mean, they're coming off 15 tough months here. So we'll have those discussions if we get a chance to be government on the 20th of September.
Thank you. Patrick, is there one more question?
Yeah, for Mr. Champoux. Is Mr. Champoux still around? Monsieur Champoux, est-ce que vous êtes toujours présent?
Is Mr. Champoux still with us?
I guess Mr. Champoux is going to ask the question about the lack of the issue of the lack of representation and diversity at Radio-Canada on the French side, and also the lack of investment of Radio-Canada in documentaries in Quebec. So maybe for next time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it's about time for us to say good night, unless there are other questions that you're burning to answer, but we said we'd be out by 8:17, and it's just about that. Patrick, do you have any thoughts after listening to the 5 candidates?
Ouais, ben on a quand même eu 5 points de vue assez.
Yes, well, we heard 5 quite different viewpoints on the future of the broadcasting system in Canada from Mr. Guilbeault, who is the Liberal candidate and Minister of Heritage Canada at the moment. It relies on a Liberal election for us to have in the first 100 days. Bill C-10 being introduced again in the House of Commons. We talked about increasing the financing of CBC Radio-Canada by $400 million, stronger financing as well of all the public federal institutions in the field of culture, and of course, legislation being introduced on prejudicial content online and also on the web giants paying royalties or fees. So Mr. Guilbeault essentially presented his program. Kevin Waugh of the Conservative Party of Canada talked about the importance of an in-depth reform of the CRTC, which is very maladapted to today's reality. When the CRTC was created with the Broadcasting Act of 1991, the internet did not exist yet in Canada and was not known to the public at large. So to Mr. Waugh, what he proposes is, of course, a reform of CBC in particular, CBC television on the English side. The Conservative Party of Canada does not want to change Radio-Canada on the French language side, but on the CBC side, that there are improvements to be made for more Canadian content and more documentaries, and especially local content on television, because CBC Radio is doing miracles throughout Canada. And on the Conservative side, also, they wish to go further than Bill C-10. Of course, they want to contribute a great deal to the Conservative Party. That is, they want to contribute to changing things if they're elected on September 20th for the Bloc Québécois. Of course, they're in favor of Bill C-10. They want some adjustments here and there. They feel that the government has really taken too long, and the government did not really deliver the goods after being elected in 2015. A bill was brought forward in 2020 and 2021, but there was not enough time to settle the issue of Bill C-10, which was never adopted by the Canadian Senate, and the Bloc Québécois would have preferred that the government take those issues more seriously and settle the issues prior to the election that was triggered a few weeks ago. And as to the New Democratic Party, of course, they feel that decisions should be done in consultation with the audiovisual sector. And it's really by having a dialogue and discussing things with the industry in Canada that we'll be able to arrive at a solution. And for the Green Party, of course, they were favorable to Bill C-10, but on the issue of the environment, they're ready to go very far on various measures, and also on the issue of diversity, which remains a very important issue for the Green Party.
So that's an excellent summation. And I'd just like to add to it that this was a time when you could see that every party had thought about this, whether you agree with them or not. There was some thinking done and some consideration given to the sector, which has not been the case before. So I think the advice that Heather gave is very interesting for the sector. Just keep talking to us, keep telling us, keep showing us, and we'll be persuaded. Would you agree? Patrick, that there
Oui,
is
absolument. Je suis d'accord avec vous. L'importance.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. The importance of communicating, of having dialogue, of maintaining the channels of communication open, regardless of which political ideology a party may have, in order to promote Canadian culture, Quebec culture in French, and French culture across Canada, of course. Of course, in order to deal with all the issues that diversity head on, or the lack of diversity for certain communities on our screens, particularly on television and on certain broadcasts. And we heard some very good solutions, more budget for documentaries, Canadian content, more new local content, and local content could be the most important aspect, the cornerstone. A lot of interesting solutions with their vision from these five parties of their vision for Canada tomorrow.
So thank you very much for being with us, and many thanks to the sponsors who worked so hard to put this together. It wasn't easy, it was done in a short time, and we thank all of you who participated for your interest and your questions. Good night.
Good night, merci, bonsoir.
Good night, thank you everyone, bye-bye.
Good night.
Merci.